Right, so this week we're going to be talking about material culture and material objects. So you'll recall this diagram from last week, looking at the relationship between not just production and consumption, but also the cultural meanings that are regulated, the representations that are put out through particular texts, objects, and practices, and the sort of dialogue between the cultural realm and our social world. So we can understand material culture as the study of cultural objects or artifacts. I always say artifacts in quotation marks because it comes out of anthropology, where it has a history of primitivizing people and creating incommensurable otherness. You know, playing along with Orientalism and tropicalization. But it is a useful term for thinking about specific objects that are filled with cultural meaning. So we can understand material culture as consisting of objects that only have the meaning that we give to them as producers and consumers. This meaning is not just what the producers intend, so therefore it's very important to pay attention to these different realms of cultural meaning that take place. So we can see this run throughout the 6 readings for the week. We begin with Sunaina Myra's Indo-Chic, which discusses the reinvention of South Asian cultural traditions within America's, uniquely US parameters. So we can think about it as a study of importation. We can see how different producers bring different sorts of awarenesses and different sorts of knowledge bases for talking about these specific practices, objects, and products. We can also see how the regulation of tradition also serves as a comment on globalization when placed in a larger cultural field. And we can also see the dialogue between what gets represented through this interplay between producers and consumers and the sorts of real-world understandings that come from it. The things that, for example, the white feminists say as opposed to the South Asian second-generation consumers. We also see this in Chaboya's piece on lowriders. So I'm less interested in the high art aspect of the article, but it is something interesting to read if you're interested in how popular culture can also make its way to high aesthetic culture through artistic practices. But what I'm really interested in is on page 142, Chaboya talks about it in terms of style politics, and in page 150 talks about vernacular forms of style. So there's no explicit meaning to a car or a leaf blower except those that we give to it. So then thinking about these unique relationships between production, consumption, and regulation. We move on to Pham and Ono's piece on Asian American t-shirt rhetoric. So the key issue in this piece is symbolic violence and how that gets put out through images and through material objects, such as the Abercrombie & Fitch t-shirts. And the key question is asked on page 188. Who benefits, who gets empowerment from these kinds of images? So then we're thinking about regulation very clearly and its relationship to representation and identity. We have Francis Negron-Butaner's piece on Puerto Rican Barbie, which is a key way to think about differences in identity. And so this is to push against the idea that things are all subjective and instead thinking about context. Here we get the difference between identities as Puerto Rican Americans and Puerto Ricans from the island of Puerto Rico as they find themselves expressed through the object of the Puerto Rican Barbie. Right? So Puerto Rican Barbie was never meant to bring about these debates around identity and difference, but through different forms of consumption and this wide field representation, we then see these differences in identity. We have Jenny Moll's piece on culinary tourism, right? Going about and eating food. So we can see how this production of tourism is done through the tourist or the customer's own perceptions of what to expect from an ethnic restaurant. But we can also see how it plays in with the host's performance of otherness. So then we're not just thinking about an object as being produced by a producer, but also as being produced by consumers in a more dynamic interchange of ideas. And finally, we have Campbell's piece on Chicano Light, talking about US consumer culture at the US-Mexico border. As we see through his study of Chico's Tacos, we see that at times identity can be produced strictly through the form of consumption and not through the production of a particular product. So here we have kind of 3 different clusters of thinking about material culture. With Myra and Chaboya, we think about styles and practices as material culture studies. With Pham and Ono and Negron-Butaner, we see commodity objects and commercial objects as complex cultural artifacts. And finally, with Moles and Campbell, we engage the field of foodways, thinking about the ways in which meanings are placed on food that come to be specifically united to cultures. So one of the things to talk about as we engage with material culture is this complex interplay of authenticity, agency, and accountability. I'll go more into this in a separate lecture. But one key dynamic to think about, if we talk about these objects in terms of authenticity, is looking at the difference between what two of the authors put forward. On page 72, Moles talks about how, quote, the concept of authenticity is an invention of Western modernity. If we're thinking about what is authentic, we're not thinking about what is organically arising from a culture, but we are thinking about our own standpoint as US consumers in the first world, projecting onto other places and other peoples and other cultures our own idea of what ought to be authentic. This is not the same as going to a country and experiencing it, because we can see that that is implicated with the concept of authenticity as a part of Western modernity, always seen through Western eyes. So we have that on the one hand. But on the other hand, we have how Sunaina Myra's piece on Hannah, Mendy, and Bindi's examines popular culture in relation to globalization, not just South Asian popular culture, but how it becomes part of US popular culture. We see how this marketing of Indo-chic suppresses the social histories and material conditions of difference. We ignore how South Asia has been locked into modes of political and economic dependency and victimization through the first world, and instead only think about multiculturalism. And of course, I love multiculturalism. I love that we live in a country where we can have this place for every culture, but as we see through these two readings, the Moles and the Myra, how within US multiculturalism, we tend to emphasize only the most exotic and understand it only as the other, instead of being a mode of cultural sharing. So this raises difficult questions about what exactly we need to talk about authentic. So instead of authentic being a thing, I challenge us to think about it as a particular cultural construction. What sorts of discourses and what sorts of modes of power go into convincing us that something is indeed authentic. We can understand it as a connection between production, representation, and identity. So for example, Moles in her piece on Thai restaurants by looking at the construction of ambiance and the menu, and as some of you have mentioned on the discussion board, the secret menu. We can understand authenticity as a two-way process. We can, as she says, it's a mutually negotiated concept between producers and consumers. So we're not just thinking about if Asian Americans and if US Latinos and Latinas are giving us authentic culture, but we're also then turning the lens on ourselves. This then relates to the list of different types of tourists that she lists at the end. Existential tourists, experiential tourists, recreational tourists, and diversionary tourists. By paying attention to the consumer with their expectations that they have of the producer, we then see how authenticity is not just this natural thing, but is a constant conversation between different standpoints. All right, I'll leave it at that.